Good morning, everyone. Just to welcome you to the session on flexible working. Just want to remind everybody of the code of conduct that will be put also into the chat box. Just obviously everyone knows about that one. It was mentioned in the previous session as well. And what we have is we've got Paul Watkins talking about flexible working. He's a national negotiator official and is working on behalf of the NSUWT. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Paul for giving us that information.
Morning, colleagues. Morning, Candy. Many thanks for your introduction. Just to repeat, my name's Paul Watkins. And I work on behalf of the union as a national negotiating official dealing with a range of different issues. One of the areas I have responsibility and remit for is the work that we do around equalities, and specifically, obviously, I'm here to talk about the work we're doing or have done around flexible working and looking at your rights and your well-being and how flexible working can have a key and fundamental part in your well-being. So I will be sharing some slides just to advise colleagues that if you do have questions, can you make sure they're put in the Q&A box, and we'll obviously look at those. And if there are questions that we can't answer, then we'll commit to take those away and see if we can get an answer to those questions as soon as possible. So please try to avoid, where possible, putting your questions in the chat. That's for you to say hello to colleagues and just say, hi, how's it going? Nice to see that you're in the room if there's a colleague you've seen or notices here who's been to other events. But we'll only really be taking the questions from the Q&A box because obviously that's what it's intended to do, and it filters out those sorts of issues for us nicely. Okay, so hopefully a sharing screen will work, and you can see all of this. Okay, so is that okay for colleagues? Candy, is that okay?
I can certainly see it, yes.
Right, brilliant. Okay, right. So I'll take you through the presentation. There will be some time, hopefully, for colleagues to ask questions. It's better if I take the questions at the end. I know you'll probably have questions as we go through it, but we'll try and take those at the end where we can. So this presentation is about looking particularly at how flexible working can help you in terms of your well-being. We know that there are issues around well-being and particularly around issues around workload, well-being, mental health. And so obviously we're looking at how hopefully flexible working can be a way in which you can address issues to do with well-being. I think it's important, though, when we talk about this, to recognise it shouldn't be seen as an excuse, in terms of you drop down to work flexibly because the way in which your employer and your workplace is managing you is unacceptable. I think there's a clear distinction there. If this is going to help you, then obviously that works for you and that's great. But obviously what we would want to do is if there are issues around your workplace and concerns, and that's meaning you think flexible working is an option for you, then obviously I think we'd want you to contact the union and make the union aware locally of those issues because, and we'll talk about this a bit later in the presentation in terms of the DfE's position on that, because the DfE's position on this issue is quite helpful. Okay, so very brief summary of what flexible working is. It's just a way of you sharing, staggering or breaking up your normal working day or week to address issues which could be your work-life balance. It could be you have a responsibility outside work. It could be you want to do a piece of study outside work. It is essentially the employee's right to decide if they want to have some flexibility in their working practice. And there's no hierarchy in terms of why you want to do that. And I think we need to be very clear with employers. If they take a view that you're doing it for a caring responsibility, then that takes hierarchy over, say, somebody who wants to do it for studying. But that's not really the correct interpretation of the regulations as they are. The regulations pre-2014 were very clear that flexible working was seen as a way for people with caring responsibilities to adapt their work to allow them to accommodate the responsibilities they may have as a parent or carer. Since 2014, that has gone, and it's the employee has a choice, irrespective of whether they've got children or not, male or female, to make a decision to go for flexible working. There are normally, you'll find, there are two processes. There's a non-statutory process and there's a statutory process. So in your organisation, your school or college, you may have more informal arrangements, for example, ad hoc flexibility around, say, a child's sports day, around, say, a graduation, around, say, a wedding, and the school is more flexible in terms of its informal arrangements. Or it could be the case that you are deciding and making a decision to adopt a more formal approach, and you want to actually work 4 or 3 days a week. That's your decision, and you want to adopt that working pattern for the next 5 or 4 years, or however long you've planned to do that, and that's your choice. Now, obviously, informal processes don't necessarily have the same process as a statutory process, and so it's important to understand that statutory process should and hopefully does include an appeal, whereas a non-statutory process may not, although it's good practice, we would argue, for both to have an appeal. The current legislation allows anybody to make a request if they've got 26 weeks continuous service, and the flexible working request, as I alluded to in my conversation just now, my discussion just now, it is the choice of the employee. So it's not for your school to say, we need everybody to work flexibly, although that might be something that you are quite keen on. So it's not the employer who imposes it, it's the employee who makes the choice. Now, unfortunately, and our experience and our research does demonstrate this, there are significant issues and sometimes barriers to accessing flexible working, and the law doesn't give you an automatic right to have it. However, it does establish how employers must respond to the request. It does establish in law only 8 business reasons for them to refuse the request. So if you've ever seen a policy with, say, 10, that's not in line with the law. So it does outline how they must deal with it. And we would argue, despite it not being within the statute, that there should be an appeals process, and most colleges and schools do have that. You can only make one formal request in an academic year or a 12-month period, depending on how your school or college operates. So that's just the background to it. But I think it's important to understand the law is changing, and it will be changing from next year. So I think, to be fair, the government has ceded the point that the regulations haven't necessarily driven more flexible working in certain sectors, including education, where we know the majority of the workforce is predominantly female, and may want to therefore access flexible working, particularly at times around having a family, if that's their choice, etc. So there is a move to change that, and the Employment Relations Flexible Working Act will include a number of changes to the current regulations. So at the moment, there is no requirement on your employer to consult with you if they're going to refuse a request. So you can discuss how maybe alternative arrangements could work. So if you request, say, 2 days a week, they may come back and say, well, we could do 1.5. How would that work? So there's now going to be an obligation on an employer to consult with you if they are intending to refuse the request. Obviously, as I referenced just now, there is currently only one request available in a 12-month period. That will now move to 2. There is currently a requirement for a decision and an appeal to have been concluded within a 3-month period. That now moves to a 2-month period as opposed to a 3-month period. And one of the barriers often cited by members around flexible working is a requirement that basically, which is often abused by employers, I think, a requirement for you as the employee making a request to basically explain how you think it's going to impact on your employer, and to suggest how you think they can be, how they can deal with it. Now, we often see a lot of policies where employers are requiring those employees making a request to write an awful lot of detail around that. And it's therefore proved a barrier for people, because people look at it essentially say, well, what's the point? I won't bother. Now, that requirement will be removed. And I think that is a positive step forward. Now, although this isn't included in the Employment Relations Flexible Working Act, The government has also confirmed its intention to legislate to make the right to request a day one right. So no longer will there be this arbitrary 6-month period. If you're working for 6 months or more, you can make a request. If you're working for 6 months or less, you can't. I think the government has acknowledged that that's been a barrier for people, and it's an artificial, arbitrary barrier, and it's impacting on people who may want to have flexible working. So you may see there's a drive to change the culture of flexible working. And I think the DfE are very keen to change the culture that operates in workplaces around flexible working, especially. So there are changes to the law, and they are going to hopefully reshape this and change the agenda somewhat in terms of flexible working. And obviously, why is flexible working important? Well, flexible working allows people, and part of this is about addressing issues regarding well-being, to address their well-being, mental health. It might be they're trying to address workload, but as I said, should that be an issue the employer needs to address in other ways and forms and mechanisms? There's an argument clearly that should be the case. So obviously, flexible working helps people to address their work-life balance. It could be beneficial for their mental health. It could be beneficial in terms of addressing issues around work. Could be obviously beneficial in terms of addressing issues regarding family commitments, or I think we should broaden that out to caring, generally caring commitments, not necessarily those just associated or restricted to families. It could be you want to do a course. It could be you just want to have a bit of fun with friends. So if you want to address issues, then obviously flexible working is an avenue that's available to you to address issues, to allow you to take time out to pursue issues outside of work and your interests outside of work. The benefits to the employer, I think the evidence is compelling now that there are significant benefits to the employer, and we could even put financial figures on some benefits now in terms of research that suggested that how much it contributes to the economy, as opposed to if employers don't, how much the economy loses out. So obviously, if we look at education, it's a key aspect or strand of the retention crisis. We know there is a recruitment crisis in teaching, but there is also, it should be recognised quite clearly, a retention crisis in terms of retaining trained, experienced, valuable members of staff. So quite clearly, one of the benefits to the employer is the retention of trained, experienced staff. I think that's really vitally important for schools and colleges to understand. There's a lot of research that says you get back quite a lot in terms of goodwill, and that translates to increased productivity. You also see significant decreases in the levels of absence for members of staff, increased motivation linked to that. If your school and your college is treating you in this way and respecting your right to request and respecting your right to pursue your interests outside school, or caring responsibilities as it may be, then obviously that could lead to increased motivation, because you as a member of staff feel that your school appreciates and understands the circumstances you are facing and is willing to understand and introduce changes to allow you to do those things. It also as well can be seen to support equality and diversity in terms of the makeup and composition of the teaching workforce. And obviously it does allow there to be access to a talent pool which may not otherwise be available, because if you're not offering flexible work, and if you look at what we said in the previous slide about move to a day one right, employers are probably going to have to start to look very seriously at offering jobs on a flexible basis. In terms of people come into the organisation, want a job, well, the job shouldn't be 5 days a week. We're willing to talk about flexible working if the colleague who may be successful as an applicant says they'd like to look at more flexible ways of working. So it doesn't allow there to be a broader talent pool that people can dip into. So the evidence is compelling. Having looked and reviewed a lot of the evidence, and a lot of the evidence in education, by the way, the evidence is quite compelling to say the benefits far outweigh the cost to employers. It's about having that, challenging that robustly and having that evidence to use in your corner. So the benefits to the employee, I think we've alluded to some of these already, but being able to balance work and home, increase quality of life. A lot more people want to do other things, pursue other interests, reduce levels of stress. People who have flexible working often report better job satisfaction. It allows people to continue in the workplace rather than drop out of the workplace. And often when people drop out of the workplace, they fall into quite insecure, intermittent, precarious work, such as working in supply, which is not the same. And the ability to ensure that people are allowed to have career development, personal growth, and allow that to fit in with a time when they need changes around their life. Now, I've given you an example there with increased family commitments. It doesn't have to be that. It could be you're doing a period of study and you need a bit of time to enable you to do that. So it enables those two things to work together, in essence, to enable you to stay in employment, but also to enable you to pursue outside interests as you see fit. So we talked a little bit at the introduction about the DFE. And one of the things the DFE has been working on, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide there, is the DFE has been working for a number of months now on revising what it calls its flexible working toolkit. And the DFE has a flexible working advisory group. For my sins, I represent the NHWT on that. There are other trade unions on it, including trade unions representing head teachers like the NHT. But also there are officials from the department. There are so-called sector experts, one being Timewise. There are also representatives from what the DFE calls its flexible working ambassador schools. There are a range of different schools in different regions that are seen as shining examples, and their job is to promulgate out and promote the benefits of flexible working, do workshops in their areas and regions, promoting the benefits of flexible working. There are also representatives from some of the larger academy trusts. For example, 2 academy trusts that are represented on the department's flexible working advisory group are United Learning and Art. And as I said at the beginning, there are trade unions like ourselves. So we meet, our next meeting is due to take place physically in November. We meet probably about 3 times a year, once a term often. And we talk about what's going on. The DFE will wax lyrical about what they're doing to encourage and promote flexible working. And obviously, I think as representatives of you, as members, we often hold their feet to the fire and challenge them on that. So the DFE Flexible Working Toolkit was in the pipeline for a number of months. The aim is to raise awareness and promote the importance and benefits of flexible working. And the resources were circulated, and we've been toing and froing with the department for a number of months now, probably the best part of a year, giving them input, commenting on their resources, and where appropriate, challenging them. And I think it's fair to say that the first iteration of what they proposed, we did send them back with a fly around their ears saying, unfortunately, that's just not good enough. But we have moved to a position where, whilst we may not say it delivers everything we want, those resources are useful and helpful, and reps and members should be utilising the toolkit in terms of challenging employers, schools, colleges, where they are quite oppositional to flexible working. So these were finally published 27th of September this year, and there will be a bulletin going out to just detail some of this a bit later on, as soon as we can get that up and ready to go. So the Flexible Working Toolkit breaks down into a number of different areas. So there are documents outlining the benefits, and particularly for school leaders communicating the benefits of flexible working in schools and colleges. There's a document called Benefiting from Flexible Working, which sets out a lot of the benefits of flexible working in educational settings, and therefore should be used to challenge barriers to flexible working in school. So it essentially looks at these things and says, what are the benefits? There's a useful document which addresses the negative perceptions. Again, I think that is quite useful because it actually challenges comments like, oh, we can't allow flexible working because of timetabling issues. We can't allow flexible working because parents don't like it. There is no evidence that parents actually have a negative perception of flexible working or teachers who work flexibly. In fact, the evidence is the opposite. It suggests that actually those teachers who work flexibly, so when classes are maybe shared, parents actually appreciate the fact there may be two types of teaching style, the fact that there may be two different teachers and their son or daughter can go to one as opposed to the other. They think there are benefits to it. Another document looks at how flexible working can be implemented, looking at school leaders and how they should think strategically with staff about their school's approach to flexible working, and contains recommendations regarding best practice. There's an example of a flexible working policy. There is also a timeline, a flowchart showing how it should work. And there is also a letter for people who want to make a statutory request. A lot of this stuff, by the way, we also have on our website. So we also have a flexible working flowchart. We also have quite detailed research and information, advice and guidance for members about how to make a request. We've got a letter, a template letter that members could use as well. So this just, I suppose, adds to that we already offer for you as members. So this just gives you some of the examples of what the flexible working toolkit is like, particularly as this is about looking at well-being and how flexible working can hopefully assist. This is looking at, obviously, the issues of well-being. So again, this is the evidence base. So if you've got a school that takes, or college who takes quite an oppositional approach to this, then they should be pushed back with this evidence, because the evidence, as I said, is compelling, it's detailed. It's not our own research. It's not got a trade union slight bias, or it's not aimed at trying to present an argument we would want to pursue. It's there. It's neutral. It's been conducted independently by colleagues outside of the Department for Education, but it seems to resonate that flexible working has a significant benefit for well-being and work-life balance. So you've got some really good concrete examples of where flexible working can help people achieve a better work-life balance. And you'll see this data is not in any shape or form dated in terms of, oh, that's data that came from 2012, 2015, 2017. This is off the shelf. It's hot off the press, some of this stuff, particularly if you look at the first one. It's from the IFF Research 2023, which looked at the costs and benefits, and studies and research interviewing school leaders. Those who were interviewed said that flexible working helps retain good staff and improves teacher well-being, which they argued would ultimately lead to better pupil outcomes. So again, if you've got this opposition from an employer saying, well, it's going to impact on pupil outcomes, where's the evidence of that? There is no evidence that we can find about how it impacts on pupil attainment. In fact, the evidence is saying the opposite. Again, you've got another bullet point there. 85% of leaders surveyed in 2021 in schools that offer flexible working agreed it had a positive impact on teacher and leader well-being, or overall teacher leader well-being. 74% of school leaders who had implemented flexible working felt the arrangements had helped staff to manage their workload, work-life balance, and that was a statement that was agreed with by 89% of teachers. So again, this is research that's relevant, it's out there, it's some of the most recent research, and it supports the argument that flexible working has a significant impact on well-being and work-life balance. Again, hot off the press, the department's working lives of teachers. We know that the working lives of teachers document suggests that there are a lot of people working significantly more hours than they really should be. But obviously, those who said they had high or very high life satisfaction were more likely to be working for an employer who worked more flexibly. Okay, and the evidence points to the reverse. if you're working in a school that's quite rigid and takes quite a rigid approach to flexible working, the rate of job satisfaction in terms of how people reported it diminishes. So you can see there's a significant change in how people report what they're feeling in terms of their life satisfaction, job satisfaction, based on whether their employer adopts or chooses to adopt a positive attitude towards flexible working. So the evidence is there. I did mention this, and I think this is important, okay? And this is important in terms of, for a start, we secured this change to documentation because we argued all along, as I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, that we didn't accept the fact that our members have to drop out and drop down and lose full pay because there are issues around workload in their school or college. We said that was unfair. And what we said was flexible working can help and can assist, but it shouldn't be the case that our members have to lose pay because of the school and the way the school operates or college operates in respect of workload and issues of workload. So there is quite a clear reference in the documentation. When you get a chance to go away from today, have a look, go online, have a look at the documentation. You can download hard copies of it. But it's quite clear that, if you look at this documentation, it does say when planning, it's important to understand that although flexible working is helpful in improving work-life balance for staff, working part-time should not be considered as a means or way of managing a heavy workload. If staff are feeling overwhelmed by workload, we would suggest working with them to review and address workload issues. So it's this idea that if you've got a school and an option for you is to drop down to 4 or 3 days a week because of the workload issues, that shouldn't be the mechanism. There should be other levers, and staff and trade unions should be involved in talking to their schools or colleges about how workload is driving up excessive hours and how workload's impacting. And so this advice and guidance is quite good in terms of reinforcing that argument that we've been having around members accessing flexible working to basically go home and still work the day they've got off, but that's a way of managing their workload, because we don't think that's acceptable. I appreciate it is a right to do that. I'm not telling people that they can't do that, but we think that's an issue about workload in and of itself, and it's something that members should be talking to their trade unions about, talking to local trade union colleagues about, and engaging with the school about. And this guidance actually makes that clear. Additional information, obviously, that we should be aware of. And again, this is in the DfE's advice. And it's also in other advice that the DfE offers. It does make it clear all employees have a legal duty to protect the health, safety and welfare of their staff. This includes minimising the risk of stress-related illness. Flexible working can form an important part of this duty, especially when integrated with broader staff wellbeing policies. So schools should be giving some serious consideration to obviously how they address issues and how they address issues regarding stress-related illnesses, and flexible working can form a part of that. So we know there are challenges out there because we know that some schools are opposed to it. I've seen some very, very interesting comments from schools in the past about their attitude towards flexible working, but these things should be thrown at them in terms of responses to challenge their culture, their mindset. Furthermore, in terms of additional information, flexible working is seen as one of the core pillars of the DfE's Education Staff Wellbeing Charter, which is a set of commitments from the department, Ofsted and schools and colleges, to champion flexible working with a remit to try and establish school cultures that support it, and not just at certain points in careers, but at all points for all people at all stages of their career. So again, this is important information when you're trying to address issues of wellbeing that can be utilised for you in terms of arguments you may have with schools or colleges about their approach. I mean, I think whilst I've praised this, I would also add the caveat that, we welcome this and we think it's a move in the right direction, but we don't think it goes far enough. Okay, so the union isn't content with all of this. We think there's more that needs to be done, particularly to address the culture in schools, where we know teachers are routinely denied flexible working and they drop out of the labour market. Okay, but what we would say around this information is that if this information is being used, we always, as a trade union, use the evidence and the evidence basis that supports our arguments and our advice and guidance. So we'll take what we can from this, and I've fleshed out some, not all. There's loads more useful advice and guidance in this document. So I've fleshed out some of the advice and guidance that members can take and they can use to challenge robustly schools and colleges. And where there are schools or colleges who take a very oppositional approach to this, then obviously do come to the union and do point it out and do point out what their reasons or rationales are, because we will challenge that. And we will challenge it using the evidence, and we will challenge it using what other levers we've got in terms of talking to the DFE, etc., and the industry and sectors on a wider basis. So those messages coming out from schools and colleges who may have a different view, we will challenge that, and we will challenge it as robustly as we can. So that takes you to the conclusion of my presentation. I see I've got a number of questions in the Q&A box. So we'll stop presenting.
I would like to thank you very much for that, Paul. It was exceptionally informative and very interesting. Just to say to everyone, there is 10 minutes until the next session, where we've got a guest speaker, Diba Said, who's talking about the rights of women. So please come back for that session at 12 o'clock. Just once again, thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. No, you're welcome. I hope you all have a very interesting and enlightening day, colleagues. It looks like the agenda is really wonderful. So thank you for your time and patience this morning.
Thank you. Bye.